Welcome back to a day in the life of the asset manager and an underwriter. And today, Lorik is going to talk to us a little bit about the asset management side. And again, just a housekeeping item, we will not have a day in the life next week because it's in between Christmas and New Year's. So, with that being said, we're going to kick it off.
All right. So today we're going to talk a little bit about resident emergencies. So uh, this is the season for these types of things to kind of pop up. If you watch any news or anything like that, starting like a couple weeks before Thanksgiving, all they talk about is like fryer fires for Thanksgiving. And right now there's a lot of news that'll go on about like potential fire hazards with Christmas trees and all that kind of thing. So I figured this is probably a good time to we could talk about kind of resident emergencies at your property, and kind of what happens, what can happen, what you can do, and kind of get you a little bit prepared for those types of things. So um, there's a few things that we typically want to hear from our property managers about when it comes to emergencies on the property. Uh, Normal emergencies, we want them to be able to handle. Like they don't have to call us and get approval to do things or let us know like, hey, we had a toilet that was clogged and we had to have a plumber come out. Like that's not really an emergency for us to handle on a day-to-day basis. Cindy always talks about, I think it's fire, flood, and blood, I think is the three. So a lot of times that it's kind of those major things that we want to hear about, and potentially be involved with resolution on. So that's anything that is going to be a detriment to our residents or impact their standard of living or potentially endanger the property. So um, when you have those kind of situations, you want to make sure that your property management company understands what the procedure is for that, that they understand what their communication chain is supposed to be. And it's always a good idea to try and have something set up ahead of time. Make sure that they have their emergency contacts for the local police or fire if there's a non-emergency line, if they need to notify people. They have their after hours plumber. They've got all those kind of contacts in place. They typically should have that. It's never a bad idea to just double check with them and make sure that that's in place. And then the other part of that is the protocol. So how does that happen? The chain of events. So typically the on-site should be reporting to the regional that there's an issue with the property. And then the regional can help them with some coordination. And then the regional should be reaching out to you to let you know that we have an incident in the property that needs immediate address. So a couple different examples that we've had. One of our properties, we had a fire in an apartment. We had a resident who was cooking food on their burners, like directly on the burner on the stove. Um, and the stove caught fire, and then his ceiling caught fire. So um, all of our units are equipped with fire extinguishers. We also have been putting fire blankets into units. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but fire blankets are great. You can hang them up. So we have them, they're hanging on the doors and the pantries on the inside. So they're easily accessed. They literally have written on it what to do, pull the tab, smother the fire, that kind of thing. They don't expire, which is great, which is something you have to deal with your fire extinguishers. You have to get them recharged every so often, depending on where you're at and what the rules are. Sometimes it's annually, you have to have those recharges done. So, um, and then they are single use, but we were able to get them at wholesale. I think we paid like $6 or $5 per fire blanket, which is super economical for something that never expires and hopefully never has to get used. And then if it does, it's very easy to do that. So that was something that we learned a few years ago was a good way to supplement or replace fire extinguishers, depending on what your code is. So we had that fire happen. The on-site contacted the fire department because we had a fire in a unit. They were able to put it out with the fire extinguisher in the unit, but the fire department still has to come out, make sure that we don't have, especially since it had lit the ceiling on fire, make sure we don't have a fire still brewing in the ceiling. And then they contacted the regional as soon as they got off the phone with the fire department, and then the regional called us and was like, "Hey, letting you know there's a fire at the property. It's being addressed." And the fire department is coming out, and then they gave us updates throughout the day to let us know what was going on. And in this case, it was something we ended up billing the resident back for because they were not using their appliance properly in the unit, and that's what caused the fire. And they were either needing to be moved into a hotel for the construction because we did have to rebuild part of the kitchen. But then they opted not to. So he lived in his unit and just he didn't have access to his kitchen for it was like a week or two. And we told him we need to put you somewhere, we need to do this. But he knew that he was liable for some of the expense because he was the one who started the fire. And he's like, nope, I'm just going to stay here and I'll deal with the construction in my unit. And so that's what he did. And we got it done as fast as we could and, tried to minimize impact on the residents' lifestyle. But yeah, that was luckily there was the means in place to put out the fire quickly. The response was handled very promptly and we were able to address it quickly. So it wasn't more damage and more of an issue than it could have been. But like that's kind of the chain that we want to see. We want to see that communication directly with our first responders, then to the regional, and then the regional is contacting us and giving us updates as it goes along. That always doesn't flow as well as you would hope. Like we've had flooding at a property that we found out like a couple days later that there was flooding at the property, and it's like that's something we need to know about. And they're like, "Oh, well, we figured we could handle it." And it's like, yeah, but this is impacting the property, impacting multiple residents. Like this is not something that you just have to kind of sweep under the rug or not think that we need to be aware of. Because we're impacting residents' living situations, like that's a big deal. So,
Um,
um,
may I ask, I came in late, which apartment project is this about that you're speaking of with the fire and all that?
that was one of our apartments in Kentucky. So,
Oh, okay, okay, okay.
yeah.
Thank you.
So there's a lot of different things that can happen. We had a resident who was walking around with a gun outside after he had gotten into an altercation with his wife. We've had fires, we've had flooding, we've had um, all sorts of stuff. So you'll never know what exactly you're going to get hit with. I know Cindy used to do, if you've been following us for a while, her Believe It or Not, and it was kind of the horror stories and not so horror stories because sometimes it was uplifting things, but a lot of times it was the craziness that happens at those properties. But your on-site's response and the follow-up is kind of the biggest thing that I think is the takeaway from this is what is that response and what is that chain of communication? It will really test your on-site. You'll figure out if you have an on-site who can handle the pressure and I guess the call for urgency or not. It's definitely something that we have as like a refiner's fire for our on-sites on whether or not they're going to make it as how well do they handle a crisis. So, and you're going to have it. There's no apartment that is going to walk away with zero incidents on site ever during your hold. Hopefully, you don't have, you know, violent altercation or anything like that, and hopefully you don't have a fire, or if you do, it's something small that you can be contained. I mean, we have one property that this was before we owned it, years and years before we owned it. But they had a building that burned to the ground, the whole building, because a kid started a campfire in their living room. And so that we acquired this property, what, 10, 12 years later, something like that, Tyler?
Yep.
So there's one building on the property that looks very different from the rest of the complex because it was built, 30 years later from the rest of the buildings. But you never know what people are going to do, and it's the response that's the big thing. So, um, do we have questions or concerns or anything like that? Or this is kind of a very broad topic, and there's a lot of things that could be talked about, but I kind of want to know what your thoughts are. What are the things that you think about when it comes to emergency situations? So,
I used to tell people in my job, I worked in the county fair industry for 40 plus years. So during the fair, it was a living city. So something always happened. And I would tell people, is blood involved and is somebody hurt? That's an emergency. Everything else is fixable.
yeah,
But in the case of an apartment building, you have to also include what damage happened to the property. That would be the only other thing I'd add in. Now I have three things.
yeah.
When you're looking at a fire or something like that, and you said that the resident or the tenant was responsible for the damages and so on, um, at what point do you say this was definitely a tenant related and this was a property problem? Where does that differentiate?
So there's a couple different factors that go into that. Specifically with this fire incident, the fire department was called, they were there. They were able to determine the source of the fire and the reason, which
Mhm.
there were no cooking implements that were used, like no pot, pan, or anything like that. The resident was cooking directly on the burners of the stove, and the fire department was able to determine that. And so
Mhm.
in that instance, we have a clear-cut case of you are not using the appliance in the way it was intended to be used and started a fire in your unit.
Mhm.
So that specifically is your fault. So a lot of times it kind of depends on the situation. Like if you have a pipe that gets burst or you have massive flooding in a unit, you working with a plumber to try and determine the cause of it. Did they put sanitary products down the toilet and kept flushing it and flooded the unit?
Mhm.
Did they, we had somebody that was trying to shove socks or something down their garbage disposal. And so sometimes it's something easy that you can determine, like a plumber comes out and it's like, yeah, there's a sock in the garbage disposal.
Oh, wow.
But sometimes you can't. And
Mhm.
when you can't kind of prove it, then a lot of times it just falls back on the property. So you try and do the best you can to determine the cause. And if the
Mhm.
resident comes out and tells you, like, that's even better. If they can tell you, yeah, this is what happened.
Mhm.
And then trying to work with your resident to get that payment taken care of. So,
Okay, thank you.
yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask, how do you collect from the tenant if they don't have renter's insurance?
You can bill them. So, um, that's the other thing is you take it out of their security deposit if like all else fails. So, but hopefully you have residence insurance. We require it at our properties. So yeah, I definitely would suggest that either setting up a policy either yourself or through your property management company, and then your residents are opting in basically when they sign the lease, or having that as a requirement as part of them signing their lease, as they provide proof of insurance. So yeah, it's cheap. Renters insurance is not expensive, and it covers them, it covers you. Like, it's something that there's no reason you shouldn't have it on your property. So
Speaking of renters insurance, whenever I'm underwriting properties, sometimes I see where like each apartment is charged, say, I don't know, $15 or $20 a month, for example, for renters insurance. Do you guys get like a blanket policy for the property itself? And then each apartment, depending on the size of the apartment, they pay a certain amount or something? Or do you think it's better if each tenant has to get their own?
so personally, I like having a policy that usually it's the property management company that holds it,
Oh,
because then you make sure your residents have renters insurance and that it's current. Like,
uh-huh.
they could come to you and say, yeah, here I have it. And show you proof. And unless you're double checking that, like, they could lapse and then you're kind of stuck.
Oh,
So,
okay.
um, but it's not uncommon to have an umbrella policy for the property, or having something written into your lease agreement that basically when they sign their lease, they're signing up for renter's insurance. So I don't know if you have more you want to touch on that, Tyler. I know that you go through some of that stuff with the underwriting, but
Yeah, I mean, not really. And from an underwriter's perspective, right? Like, if they're currently charging for renter's insurance and collecting it, I make sure that like I take that out of my underwriting because we usually require it, because we don't want to double count on that happening. But yeah, typically it's based off of like an individual, because people can provide their own insurance, and they can say, hey, I have renter's insurance, and they can get theirs covered. Um,
Hmm.
so yeah, yeah, like I said, from an underwriting perspective, that's what I do, and even though we require it for everybody, at most I say a 50% adoption rate on the underwriting side, because again, people can provide their own insurance. So
Okay, thank you.
yep.
David, you got your hand up?
Yeah, I put the question in the chat, and that is for one of the things you mentioned. I mean, I actually have done this 28 years in renting to people, and I can see how people would start a fire in the living room because somebody thought it was fun, or cook food on their stove, and gee, let's try it. And what's the harm? But nonetheless, the question put in the chat for plumbing or sewage stoppage, in other words, what did they do to create that? We recently got a plumber to say, well, what we'll do is run a camera. The camera cost and the X amount of dollars per hour and per foot, blah, blah, blah. We'll try to go find it. And they recommend that. Um, it's a revenue model. As you know, plumbers typically charge a little bit more than law firms now. There's jokes about lawyers leaving their law practices to become plumbers.
Yeah.
But what I put in the chat was, how can we get property insurance coverage to cover that? Because the policies I'm aware of do not cover that. And one of the things mentioned was, well, there's renter's insurance. And then the other thing is we always have umbrella policies. Can we tap an umbrella policy on items like that, or would renter insurance? My question is, I've seen it happen enough times, say 3 times in the last 3 years, where it's worth asking that question. I'll give you an example. We had a big hurricane here probably a bit over a year ago, and the hurricanes toppled a bunch of trees down to the back of the property. One of them landed on top of the property, made it look like a big wig on front of the property, didn't crack the roof, so we were able to get that removed. But all of the falling in the back, we didn't know it had fallen on the septic tank and cracked the head of it, which caused a problem a year later. And then a year later, when that stoppage was there and it flooded back up in there, you try to go back to State Farm, and State Farm had already ceased and cut it, but you get a North Carolina licensed independent insurance adjuster to go after them and say, no, this was a result of that. And they say, well, that particular incident didn't happen until we were off the hook. And so you get to see these arguments. But is there any way to get that sort of thing covered by insurance is my question. I've not had luck doing it so far.
That is a good question. I don't know that I'm the right person to answer that because a lot of times we try not to go through our insurance if we can, depending on the cost, because you always get a hit to your premium. And so, especially when it comes to like scoping lines, a lot of times, even if you have an issue, sometimes they view that as a preventative thing, because you're going outside of whatever the issue was. So if you have a break in the line, like scoping it is just looking outside the break. So it depends on I guess what your purpose for it was and how your insurance views that purpose. So, um, but we have not had a lot of insurance claims that we've put against our property insurance just because of the fact that usually the deductible is pretty high, and you are going to take that hit. So a lot of times we try and settle that outside of it, if it is something that's not a resident responsibility, and then we would go through the renter's insurance. So
One of the things I put in the chat there was we had historically used AHS or American Home Shield, which if you're paying that monthly premium, say 100, 130 bucks a month, used to be 50, 60 bucks a month years ago. But you're paying that, then that means that they will cover items like this depending on the plan. You have to check if it includes plumbing, that sort of thing. So they do. They'll send somebody out there who'll cover the bulk of it. You might have $300 or $400 overage, which is quite the bargain compared to the $2,000 it takes to fix some of these problems. Is there such a thing in the apartment world, like, home warranty coverage or some type of policy you can pay for like that? And if so, has anyone ever tried it or used it? Is it worth discussing?
not that I'm aware of, but I don't know if anybody has heard of it. I've only seen it in single family, so. Yeah. I don't know. I would kind of be surprised if there was one just because of the amount of material that you would be covering with a policy like that. And then you're dealing with renters in an apartment complex, which there are a lot of great renters out there who take very good care of their units, but there's a lot of people that don't. So I just wonder if the amount of claims would be something that would put off a potential company like that. I don't know. Like I said, I've never heard of it, so if somebody has, I'd love to hear about it. But I mean, we had a American Home Shield warranty on our house we had before this one, and we replaced our hot water heater and we replaced the HVAC and something else with it, and so it was good for us then. We had a house that was 35 years old, 40 years old, something like that. So, but not that I'm aware of for apartments. All right. Anything else?
Tyler and Lorik, are
Yes.
you guys also hosting next Monday?
No, we are not. Our office is closed from Christmas to New Year's, and so we're going to take next week and take some time off. So we will not be hosting next week.
Okay, nice. Merry Christmas to you both and to everyone as well, and Happy New Year.
Yeah, thank you. You too.
Thank you.
We got a few minutes left on our time here. Is there any other questions?
I think so. That was really good. But the insurance stuff, like you said, if you guys can handle it, or if owners can handle it without the insurance, so CapEx being so important so that those insurance policies don't go up or, yeah. So
Yep.
very good conversation. Thank you.
Yep, that's a balancing act for sure. Trying to determine what the cost of repair is and if it falls under insurance, and then is it going to be worth it in the long run to file a claim through your insurance? So we just had that at our Mississippi properties last year. We had really bad storms come through, and we had a bunch of trees go down, and we got damage to some of the buildings and stuff. And when it all came out for us to try and submit a claim, we would have saved maybe $5,000. But in the long run, we're going to pay for that in our insurance premiums going up. So we just paid it out of pocket. So.
And also, I mean, after you get the report from the fire department after a fire's been started, that gives you a lot more information, because all of this is very much like you have to know more about what's going on before you can make any kind of decision on how to move forward. And you'll also need to get somebody out there to tell you how much money it's going to be in order to fix what went wrong. And then that also gives you more information to move forward with. So everything for sure is a case by case basis as you do all that stuff. David?
Well, I asked my phone, basically AI, said, does AHS cover apartment units and apartment buildings? And is there any merit to that discussion and rhetoric? And it came back with a yes. I'm going to put it in the chat of what I'm seeing there and see if there's a way to just put that information in there. Apparently they do. They said you have to call for multiple properties discounts. So I put what I know in the chat. Apparently, in other words, we oversee over 20 doors in single family and duplex. It's 25 altogether if you're looking at duplex things. So we use that on everything, and I will have a dialogue with them and say, what do you charge if we buy a 60 or 100 unit apartment if we want to continue this game? The benefits to it have been somebody has a plumbing issue, sewage issue like this. You go on your online, you request service, check, click a pay button for like $130 trip charge is done. Usually that covers it. It can be a refrigerator that went out. They're replacing something. They get to it pretty quick. It could be a plumbing issue, sewage stoppage. It could be ice maker, anything. Anyways, for us, it's been economical enough to, for example, if you got to replace a compressor in an air conditioner, they're handling that. So it's financially fit us. I just had no idea that they did anything with apartments. So I'll have a conversation with them and then try to report back next meeting, see what they say about it.
Okay. I appreciate it.
There's always things that come up that you hadn't thought of before. Tenants appear to have creativity beyond reason. And you find, I'd never thought, but yeah, I was a boneheaded kid once, and I thought it'd be fun. Let's see if we can do a little cute fire and roast some marshmallows here in my living room on the carpet. I guess there's always something.
There is always something. Yep. Definitely.
Sure.
All right.
Sadly, not
thank-
everybody has the same responsibility for other people's properties as we all seem to.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's somehow or another, I guess you see signs in some places, in the bathrooms, please do not put anything other than toilet paper and waste in the, please no, and they list some things. And I'm thinking, we probably ought to have that in the welcome book or manual or some news, something that you send to every resident guest. Oh, by the way, a few minor details that you might want to pay attention to is, and you list those things, if you have children, please let them know the importance of this, because children are children. They don't always know or think.
Yep. All right. Well, thanks for jumping on, everybody. We definitely appreciate your time. And yeah, we will not be meeting next week. Hopefully you'll see notification of that going out here soon. And we hope that you have a good Christmas or whatever holiday you're choosing to celebrate or not celebrate. And have a good new year. Hopefully 26 is going to be a great year for you. We're hoping that it's going to be a great year for us. So, but we will touch base with you in the new year. So
Thank you guys very much. Merry Christmas.
Merry
thank
Christmas.
you. Merry Christmas.